I feel very ashamed. But one year I will surprise you, and I'll do it in Arabic. But I'm not going to name the year. Right, so we've got quite an ambitious programme this year. We're going to try to do we're going to do several things. One of them, we're going to do a regional red list assessment of all the mammals of Arabia. Now that's going to involve the actual red list assessment itself, but it also means we need to update the status, because if we don't have information on the population and the trends and so on, we can't do the full assessment. And this year is 2016. It's 25 years since the publication of The Mammals of Arabia, the book by Harrison and Bates, which we refer to frequently as Harrison and Bates. And I'm very pleased to say that Dr. Bates is actually with us. He's joined us this year. I'm not sure if he's here to put his hand up and show everybody. Yeah, at the back there. So if you want to talk to Paul about that any time. So it's quite an opportune moment to update all this information. And we're going, as well as the written information on the distribution, the status, we want the threats, protected areas, conservation measures, and so on. I mean, Craig can go into more detail later on this, of what we'll need. We're also going to be doing some mapping to try to get more accurate and reliable maps of the distributions within the Arabian region. And Peter Bradshaw here is a GIS expert. He's going to be working, well, sort of on his own or individually with people, and as we complete the species maps, we'll take them to him to review. And we'll be looking at maps, both the dot maps, location maps from the Harrison and Bates book, and also the polygons from the Red List websites. We've got 2 base maps for each species, and we'll try to refine both of those maps and then combine them into one by the end of the meeting. At the same time, we're going to do a status review of all the marine mammals of the region. And by the region, I suppose we ought to start out by saying what the region is. Now, this is always extremely difficult. We have the Arabian Peninsula, which is more or less we know. But we're adding to the Arabian Peninsula also Lebanon and Iraq and Syria. And we had this problem with the breeding birds. What exactly do we call that area? It's not exactly the peninsula. If we say it's Arabia, well, that's the whole of people speak Arabic, I guess, which includes Morocco and Chad and a huge area, so it's not that either. It's not the Middle East, because the Middle East also includes Egypt and Iran and Turkey. So I'm just using the term, the Arabian region, as just my own shorthand for meaning the Arabian Peninsula plus Lebanon plus Iraq and Syria. So basically everything from the northern border of Iraq and Syria with Turkey and Iran southwards down to the Arabian Sea. So that's our region. From the point of view of the marine mammals, we've got 3 marine areas. We've got the Red Sea, the Gulf, and the Arabian Sea in the south. I mean, so we've got 3 marine areas to cover. Now, it's very difficult to do a regional red list assessment for marine mammals, mostly, because they tend to move rather a long way, and it's difficult to define the region. There are a couple of species that we can do, though. One, of course, is the dugong, which is not a pelagic migrant like the other. Doesn't move across the oceans like the other species. And there's also an interesting small population of humpback whales that lives off the coast of Oman, which is genetically distinct, and it's also behaviourally distinct. It doesn't move very far. And this population already has a population level assessment on the IUCN website from 2008, I think. And we'll be just reviewing that tomorrow when Rob Baldwin from Oman arrives, who is an expert on that particular population. Now, we'll also, during the course of the few days, we may have a few presentations. If people have got anything with them, let me know and we'll just schedule these in. But we're not going to have a block of presentations. It'll just be one in the morning or whatever. So tomorrow, for example, Rob Baldwin will just give us some information on this rather unique population of humpback whales. So that one will be available for everybody to attend. For the rest of the time, we're going to split into 3 groups. 1, the marine mammal group, and then 2 red list assessment groups. It's a bit difficult to just give you more details, because I have no idea who's going to go into which of those groups yet. Can you just put your hand up, please, if you want to work on marine mammals, just so I get an idea of about how many. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Oh, okay, so thanks very much. Good, excellent. We have a small presentation also from Dr. Al-Mansi in Saudi Arabia, who unfortunately couldn't be with us, but he sent us a presentation which we can show. And if anybody else has one, and anything to show, or we might ask a few people just to give us a verbal report on an update on various things at certain times. So it's going to be a fairly informal structure to how things work. So in a moment, Dr. Craig Hilton-Taylor here, head of the Red List unit, as I said earlier, is going to just go through what a Red List assessment at the regional level really consists of and how important it is. But before then, Dr. Phil Seddon is going to just explain how the protected area component is going to work alongside this. But as I've said, we're going to have a very informal structure, and you'll be able to move from one group to another as the case may be. And it may often be that we actually ask people with specific knowledge, can you please just go to there for the time, because we need some information on that aspect. So we've got somebody here, Hannah Raza from Kurdistan region of Iraq. We may need her to go and give some information on small mammals or the other mammals and so on. So, Phil, please, if you want to just go... yeah, sure.
So, with the assessment of mammals,
yep.
are we talking about carnivores?
All mammals. Every mammal. Every species has been recorded in the region. Yeah. Now, some of these species we'll know a lot about, like the Arabian leopard, for example, which we've covered at these workshops many times. We've got some really good experts here. I mean, I saw Andrew Spalton and Hadi Al-Hikmani here, who know every leopard in Oman almost by name now. They work so hard. We've got great experts on the Arabian oryx. So for some species, fantastic information. For some of the bats, we'll know probably nothing. But exactly. But in the group, we'll get down to that detail as to whether we know enough to assess it or not. Yeah.
Thank you, David, and can I just add my welcome to see you. Thank you for coming. It's great to see familiar faces from other years and to see some new people joining us perhaps for the first time. Because the task of assessing all the mammals in the Arabian region is quite an ambitious one, that is going to be the focus. So there is no parallel sessions on protected areas. The protected areas session, the way it's going to work is really in support of the Red List assessments. So rather than thinking that you might want to divide yourself and go and spend some time in protected areas, the expectation is that you would devote your attention to some aspect of mammal assessment within this tent here for the bulk of your time here. That is because an important part of the assessment, even if you perhaps don't have specific knowledge of the taxonomy or necessarily the conservation status, but understanding something about the relationship between the distribution of species and protected areas, I think, is an important component. Having said that, Mike Knight and I are going to set up a small shop in the library, so not in a tent this time. We're going to sit in the library with our GIS expert, and what we would like to try and do is compile the best possible, most up-to-date information about every protected area within the Arabian region, as David's explained it. So we've compiled information in preparation for this. We have data sheets on what we think are all the current areas. But what we would like to do is get people who have particular knowledge about different countries or regions to come and spend a bit of time with us, sit down with us for 15, 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever it takes, review the information we've got and make sure that we have things right, or fill in the gaps where we're not sure, sit with our GIS expert and make sure that the locations and boundaries of things are correct. If you have shape files, to share that information as well. What we'll probably do is for the morning sessions, we're going to remain in the tent here. It's going to be in the afternoon after lunch. We'll announce perhaps different areas that we're interested in seeing people from. If your time is limited here, you want to share some information, catch up with Mike or me, and we'll schedule some time to sit down with you in the library session. And it could be individually. You might have a number of people representing a region come and sit with us in the library. for whatever amount of time it's required. Even if you just want to come and tell us where to find information or tell us of people we should be speaking to. So no specific protected area parallel process, but we're going to want to speak to pretty much everyone in here and find out what you know about your protected areas, make sure that we've got the best possible information. The idea is that the assessment of mammals, the updated information about protected areas will all come together when we start producing distribution maps of the different mammal species and overlaying those with what we know about protected areas. And it's the hope for some species anyway, where we have the best possible distribution information, that we can start to do a very simple gap analysis. So we can say, where is this species protected? Where should it be protected? And we see how well things are functioning within the region. We'll work towards that over the next few days. Thanks, David. Mohammed.
Just a recommendation. It's, now there is two things. One is regarding the protected area. The second one is the red listing.
Yes.
So if it's possible that, like for protected area example, perhaps sometime for each country example, that they select 2 or 3 people they can come to you in this time.
Yes.
Because they will, so example Saudi from 9 to 10 or something like this. So
Yep.
people who is in that, if it's half kind of a program. And then you come for the red listing. And I think during the time of working, maybe select some, a time that people who's working in these issues, that they come to you for that. When they discuss the species, they will go there and like come with pick up the thing. But probably nice to have sometimes
Yes.
as a protected areas
Yep.
to,
So what Mohammed Shabrak was saying was suggesting we have actually scheduled times for different regions to come and see us. That is the intent. I think it's a very good idea. Mike and I will draw up a kind of a roster for who we want to see. It'll probably start off this afternoon after lunchtime. So we'll say we're interested in people who have information on these regions. Come and find us in the library. And we'll work our way through. That's not to stop anyone from coming seeing us at any time if you're only here for a day or you're here for a short time. That's very good. Thank you, Mohammed. Were there any other questions about how the protected areas side of things may work? As David said, a more informal structure, a lot to get through, but I think it's all achievable. Thank you, David.
Thanks, and I probably should just add, because that was a very useful question, that we don't want anybody to miss out. And if you've got knowledge of certain things and you're in one place and you haven't been able to contribute, then we'll make sure that everything is available to be reviewed and checked by everybody, essentially speaking, so that whether that's an assessment, the status data, the map, or protected areas information, we'll just make sure that everybody will get the chance to kind of go backwards and forwards, so that you've not, if you're doing one thing, you'll get the chance to have something to say on something else at a different time, just to do that. And if we have to just adjust the schedule a little bit to make these things work, we'll do that. It's not fixed. Right, so we're going to introduce Dr. Craig Hilton-Taylor, head of IUCN's Red List Unit, who's going to give us the expert information on what a regional Red List assessment is.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everybody. It's a great honor and privilege for me to be here today. This is the first of these workshops that I've been to in Sharjah. Several of my colleagues have been to past workshops, but I haven't had the opportunity to come myself, so it's a great privilege to finally be at one of these and participate in one of these workshops. As David says, I'm the head of the IUCN Red List Unit. I've been running this unit for the last 16, 17 years. But as you'll gather from my accent, I'm originally from South Africa. I see there are many South Africans in the room, so I feel as though I'm amongst lots of familiar friends and faces. I haven't done many workshops in this region, but from the workshops I have done, I can see some familiar faces and people that I've known from previous workshops. It's great to see people again here. In talking about the Red List, it's always difficult these sorts of workshops as to how much detail you go into. So I'm going to give a very, very general overview of the process. Lots of you have done red list assessments before. Just as a matter of interest, show of hands, who's done red listing before? So about a third to a half of people. So lots of you will know about the process, will be very familiar with the terms, but lots of you this is your first red list workshop, this will be very new information, and you'll hear all sorts of strange terms and words that you've never heard before. So you just have to bear with us. We're not going to go into teaching you what all these different things are here now, but during the course of the week, you'll become very familiar with the terminology that we use in the red list process. Also, one thing I want to point out from the outset is that we are currently busy with the third global reassessment of all the mammal species of the world. So working with the team at the University in Rome and all the mammal specialist groups, we're trying to reassess all the species. So the work that's been done at this workshop this week will feed into that global process. So there are not many endemics, about 15, 16, 17 endemics or so. So obviously those will be, whatever we decide at this workshop, those will become the global assessments once they've been approved by the global working groups. But all the regional assessments are key information. It feeds into the global process. So the work you're doing here is feeding into this whole initiative that's happening across the world to look at the status of mammals and how they're doing across the whole world. So it's a very important contribution. So what is the aim of this whole process? So it's to provide information and analyses on the status, the trends, and the threats to species in order to inform and catalyze action for biodiversity conservation. So it's quite a simple goal, really. But it has many, many important and varied uses, particularly at the regional and national level. So having a regional red list like this helps you to monitor status of biodiversity across the whole region, across the Arabian region. You can identify the priority species and the habitats that they occur in for conservation action. Really important aspect is you can identify knowledge gaps. We've already had a question about the small mammals, the bats, the rodents. We know very little about them. We're going to discover at this workshop how much we do know and where the knowledge gaps lie, so that we can then guide future research work within the region. This is really key information for guiding site-based conservation planning. Without that, we don't know where to place the protected areas, how to manage them for all the species that occur in those areas. Also very important is how we use the information from the red list process to communicate what's happening in terms of conservation and to raise awareness of the issues and the threats to the species within the region. And of course, it's very important where there's lots of development happening in this area, how we provide the species information to inform the environmental impact assessments of those developments. So all the basic information we gather here is really important to guide future development within the region. And of course, it helps to guide the allocation of resources for biodiversity conservation. Once you know what your priority species are and where they are, you can then invest your resources in the right places. So many, many useful outputs from this workshop. And of course, the last one is that it's very important for supporting policy development. And if you look at the international arena, all the countries within the Arabian region are members of these various international conventions, whether it be CBD, the Ramsar Convention, CMS, good to see Lauke here, CITES, and so on. So all this information that's gathered here on the mammals will feed into these, into the reporting mechanisms to these international conventions, and also to help guide some of the decisions that are made at those conventions at the parties of those conventions as to what they may want to implement in terms of policy for the region. So with all that background, let's just step back a moment and just remind ourselves what the red list process is all about. So all we're trying to do with the red list assessment of the mammals is to come up with an estimate of their extinction risk. So what is the likelihood of any mammal species in this region becoming extinct in the near future, given what we know about the current population trends for the species, its range, and recent, current, or future projected threats to the species. So it's a very simple process, looking at the extinction risk. So the red list by itself is not a priority list of species. You have to add in other factors about the species, evolutionary distinctiveness, how much resources you have to protect the species, also to other factors that may come into play to set up your conservation priorities. And that's why that links across to the protected areas work that's happening in parallel to the assessment process, because those two things work together to help set your conservation priorities. So there are three main components to a red list assessment. We first come up with the red list category and the criteria. So an example of a dragonfly here, and you see it's listed as vulnerable, and then there's a strange set of hieroglyphics, characters and numbers that follow after that. Those are the criteria. And by the end of this meeting, you'll be talking about something being A2, A, B2, A, B3. And you'll all know exactly what that means by the end of the workshop, hopefully. Really key to the assessment is gathering information about the species. Information that you may know about the population size, population trends, the range of the species, what the threats to the species might be. And particularly important here are animal health issues, and that's why we had the veterinary group meeting in the tent next door, so they can share information with us about incidents of disease and how that may be affecting some of the species. And then, of course, the conservation measures. Are they in protected areas? Are they not in protected areas? Do we need protected areas for some of these species? So that links across to the protected area component. And of course, the range map. Having a map of where the species occurs is really critical to anything for the species. To do the assessment, to do your conservation planning, to really inform where developments take place. That map is really the gold that you want to get around the species. And as David said, we're working with maps here of two different kinds of maps. The very broad polygon maps from the global red list, which are very general, especially for the non-endemics for the region. And then we have the point maps from the Harrison and Bates book. So combining those and using your collective knowledge, you can then really refine the ranges within the region, and that will help to gather really important information about where these species are, and that can then be used for planning. Just to touch on briefly what can be assessed, this is all very much about the global IUCN red list, but usually that flows down to the regional and national red lists. So we usually focus on described species. It has to be an accepted name that's published in the literature. We do sometimes include undescribed species, but there has to be clear evidence that it is something distinct. There is a museum specimen somewhere for it, that you know about the range for it, and that there's a process underway to actually describe that new mammal species. And in doing the listing, there's a clear conservation benefit to doing the listing. So we don't know of any at this stage, but there may be some new species that may be in the region that may come forward in the workshop, and we'll have to decide whether we assess them or not. We can also look at subspecies and varieties, but the main focus of this workshop will be at the species level, and within those accounts we may talk about particular subspecies that are of importance for conservation to sort of draw the distinction. So Arabian leopard, there are two subspecies that are potentially in the region, so we may want to just mention that in the account. Very important aspect, which I'll come to a bit later, is that at the regional level, you also have to apply the guidelines for regional application of the red list criteria. We'll touch on that a bit later. And the whole process is looking at wild populations inside their natural range. So that's really important. Especially in this region where animals are being moved around, we have to consider, is that part of their natural range, historic natural range? Where there have been reintroductions, have those animals bred? Are they offspring breeding before we can actually start counting them as mature individuals? Some of the animals that have moved into protected areas, are they so intensively managed that it's almost like a mini zoo, so we want to exclude those because they're not really a wild population? And we'll have that kind of discussion as the week goes on as to which populations we may want to include, which ones we may want to exclude, because we don't think that they are really representative of the wild situation. So the IUCN red list categories and criteria, we have 5 criteria which are used, quantitative criteria which are used for triggering the listing, A to E. So these are based on general characteristics of species which can be used to detect whether they are vulnerable to extinction or not. So looking at population reductions, looking at species with restricted ranges and under some sort of decline, very small population sizes and under some sort of decline. Criterion D, where you have just tiny, tiny populations where any catastrophic event can wipe them out very quickly. And then criterion E is where you have lots and lots of information. You can do a full quantitative analysis, population viability assessment or some other quantitative approach. So you don't have to meet all of those criteria, you only have to meet one of the A to E criteria, and there are various thresholds within that, and that will then trigger one of the categories on the right. So those are the criteria used to measure to decide which of the 3 threatened categories you go into. Those are the middle ones: critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable. So critically endangered are the species that are at highest risk of going extinct in the near future. Vulnerable, less risk, but we're still concerned about them going extinct in the near future. So the range of categories, there are 9 categories on the right-hand side. Data deficient, where we have so little information, we don't really know enough to assess the status of the species. It may be taxonomically poorly known, or we just don't have enough information about population sizes, ranges, trends, and so on. And so a lot of the small mammals, rodents and bats, may end up in the data deficient category. But you don't have to know about the species itself. You can also use information about the area where they occur. If you know there are threats in a particular area, and you know from other species in the area that they are being impacted by those threats, you can then infer from one species to another, or you can infer from what's happening to the habitat to the species. So you can use a whole range of information, even if you don't know exactly what's happening to the species itself. And that's really important, and we'll keep coming back to that during the workshop. Then the other categories, least concern, tend to be your widespread abundant species. There's a low risk of extinction, and then going up through the scale towards extinction, where, as far as we know, the species have gone completely from the wild. So this is a summary sheet of the criteria. You can't read that from the back of the room at all, but you'll be looking at this sheet intensively over the next few days. You'll be using it as your reference work all the time. As I say, it's a summary sheet. There are much more details in the Redis Guidelines booklet, which there are copies on the table over there, which each group will have. And there's a much more detailed document of how you interpret the Redis categories and criteria. It's about 120 pages of guidelines to interpret the 30 pages of rules. So you'll get to know some of that as we go on. But essentially, at the very top, we have the headings for the 3 threatened categories: critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable, going from left to right. That's criterion A, which is the population reduction criterion, either reduction from the past, in the future, or a combination of past and the future. Criterion B is looking at the range of the species and some form of decline and fragmentation to the range in the population. Criterion C is looking at small population sizes. So as soon as you're less than 10,000 mature individuals, you are potentially threatened with extinction. And then it depends on various other characteristics of the population, is it fragmented and so on, how it's structured. Criterion D, any species which has less than 1,000 mature individuals, as breeding individuals, is potentially in one of the threatened categories. And E is the quantitative analysis, which you probably won't do, or potentially could do some of the species here.
I'm not aware of any species in the region.
Region.
Which has got
Okay.
that level of detail.
Okay. Then that red box highlights the criteria that need to be met if you get a list of species as critically endangered. That's for endangered, and that's for vulnerable. So what we'll be doing is working through the information. We first of all gather the information for each species, what we know, and then we then look at the criteria sheet and see how does our information fit against the thresholds in the criteria. And bear in mind, these are not precise thresholds. You don't have to know exactly that your population size of your animal is 5,722. If it's between 5,000 and 9,000, that's fine. It can be very, very coarse, because the thresholds themselves are very coarse in their nature. So you don't have to have precise information. Now, as you go through the categories and criteria, there are lots of different terms and concepts behind the red list, and we don't have time here to go into all of these, but just to show you some of the terms that are used. We use severely fragmented a lot, and this is how the species is either naturally or because of various threats to it becomes fragmented across the range that it occurs in, and that has a big role to play in extinction risk. Species with that occurs in lots of small fragments, as those fragments become more and more isolated from each other and smaller, then your extinction risk tends to go up. Location, this is a term that gets highly confused and lots of debate around it, and In retrospect, we wish we used a different term for it in the red list system, but location is not a locality. It's not a place where you've collected that specimen. Location is a geographically area or an ecological area which is affected by the same threat. So if there's an oil well, what area does that oil well, or the activity around that oil well affect? That is what defines your location. If the threat is hunting, it could be over a much bigger area. So location will vary in size depending very much on the threat, and how many locations you have will depend on the nature of the threats. Then there are two measures of the range: extent of occurrence and area of occupancy. Extent of occurrence is just drawing a polygon around the limits of the range, and area of occupancy is exactly where within the known range the species actually occurs. And you use grid cells to try and measure that, 2 by 2 kilometer grid cells. So it's quite a fine scale that you're measuring the range in that case. Generation length. This is the average age of the breeding individuals of your species, and that will be a discussion for some of the larger mammals. Does your population fluctuate? Because if you have something that has extreme fluctuations, when it's in a downwards phase in the fluctuation, that could make that species more vulnerable to extinction risk. So that's an important part of the life history of the species that we need to know about to factor that into the assessment process. Is it undergoing some sort of decline? Is it a continuing decline? It doesn't matter how large or how small. It could just be a 0.1% continued decline per year. That's sufficient to trigger some of the criteria. Whereas looking at population reductions, how much is the population size reduced? That requires much more information to work out what may have happened there. But you don't have to know about the species itself. You can infer that from what's happening to the habitat. If you have measures of rates of habitat loss, and if you know how the species uses that habitat, is it evenly dispersed or is it very patchy in its distribution in the habitat, you can use that information to infer or suspect population reductions. Mature individuals, these are the breeding individuals in the population, or individuals that are capable of reproduction. And with the red list, we look at population sizes being just the numbers of mature individuals, and then how those are spread out across the landscape in either geographically or ecologically distinct groups. Those are what we call our subpopulations. So the word population and subpopulation is used slightly differently in the red list context to how it's used in normal population biology. So just bear that in mind. When you look at the summary sheet, you'll notice there are lots of words like observed, estimated, projected, inferred, or suspected. So that shows you don't have to have precise information. Not everything has to be observed. You don't have to have quantitative figures for absolutely everything. You can base it on inference and suspicion. Just as long as you're clear about what you're using and that you're allowed to use suspected or whatever the term may be against that criterion, that's fine. You can use that, put that into the assessment. It's transparent, and if better information comes in the future, you can then use it to then correct the assessment and improve the listings as you go forwards into the future. That's the important thing about the red list process. It's an iterative process. We do the regional assessment now. Maybe another 5-10 years' time, we may do it again for the region, and then we see how things have changed. New information has come forwards, better information, and then we can correct some of the mistakes that may be made before. So any assessment that we do this week, you base it on your current knowledge of the species and the region. It may or may not be correct, but it's your best information you have, and so that's your best estimate of the extinction risk. As you gather new information, you then can change your assessment. That's important to, so don't get worried if you're doing things right or wrong. This is our best attempt to try and come up with what we know for the region. There are various tools that we're going to be using during the week. So this is the little rule book for the IUCN Red List categories and criteria, and that's sort of set in stone. It was adopted by IUCN Council back in 2001, and we don't want to change those rules. If we keep changing the rules, then every assessment we can't compare the assessments. So we try to keep the rules fixed. We have another set of guidelines for how you apply the rules at a regional level, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Those are much more flexible because they're guidelines, so we can adopt and change those as they go along. And lots of the guidelines are very loose, and we'll be making some decisions here at this workshop about aspects to do with the guidelines, what will work best in this region. The rulebook, because it's set in stone, when it was written back in the early 90s and 2000s, lots of things have changed since then, and how you interpret some of the issues that we're encountering in conservation biology have changed. It was, when the system was devised, the red list criteria were very much at the cutting edge, and we've got lots of new information now about various issues to do with some of the parameters that are used in the red list process. And so we have this living document, the guidelines for how you interpret the rulebook. And that brings into play some of the new advances in conservation science, and also as we've expanded the coverage of the red list. When we first started back in the 90s, we had no fungi on the red list. Now we have about 40 fungi, but there's a whole set of issues there. What's a mature individual in a fungus? What's the generation length? So as you expand into different taxonomic groups, we come up with different issues and how we apply the terms to those species. And so the guidelines is the kind of document that helps to address those kinds of issues. So those guidelines get updated at least once every year, and so it's important to keep yourselves abreast of those changes if you're doing red listing on a regular basis. We then have the summary sheet, which we'll be using all the way through the workshop. Just remember, it's a summary. We have to always go back to the rules to check the full definitions. And for the global red list process, we have another manual of how you go about documenting your species, and it's this in-house IUCN style guide, which is not very relevant for this workshop. And then we have rules of procedure for the IUCN process, which get updated every 4 years. And all of that information is on the IUCN Red List website. You can go there under the resources section, and all these documents are there freely available to download, and you can check if there's the new versions of those documents on the website. So the system was devised initially to be used at the global level, but many countries want to do national red lists, and then regions are increasingly doing regional red lists. So the system was devised to be applied at a global scale, but as soon as you move to a regional scale, do the thresholds work? How do you assess the extinction risk of something at a regional scale, which may be impacted by populations outside of the region? And so that's why these regional guidelines were developed. So the kinds of issues that we're going to be dealing with in this workshop, you'll have species in these sort of scenarios where a species may straddle different country borders. So that example there's species in the middle is across 3 different countries. If you're in this country here and you're assessing the status of that species, your population may be impacted by the population on that side and on that side. So how do you factor that into your assessment? It may be that you've got isolated subpopulations and there's movement between them. If you're doing a national red list in this country, how do you factor in those movements of individuals in and out of your country? Some of the bats, or more importantly, some of the cetaceans, they may be moving around between the country borders. So maybe here part of the year, then moves up there and spends summer months in those waters, or even go further south or north. So how do you factor in migratory species? You're doing an assessment of this tiny little subpopulation in this country here, but the vast bulk of the population is sitting outside. How do you factor that into your assessment? Should you even bother to do the assessment? If you're doing a red list in this country here, and you've got a tiny fragment of the population, and that fragment is really dependent on individuals coming in from outside, if you don't have those individuals coming in, your population goes extinct in your country. How do you, so that's what we call a sink, a population sink. How do you go about assessing that? So there's a whole range of different scenarios that happen when you're doing assessments at a regional or national scale. What about introduced species? How do we factor those into the assessment? Species that have gone extinct within the region, but they still extant globally. How do we assess them? So in this example here, we're doing a red list for this particular country here. And you have this scenario where your population is getting smaller and smaller and smaller in your country. So globally, it's quite stable outside, so it's globally listed as least concern. But within that country, it's regarded as being threatened. One scenario. Different scenario. Outside, it's going down, but inside the country, it's staying stable. So globally, it might be listed as threatened, but in your country, it might be least concern. So you can get both scenarios happening. There's a very good example of that in the region. So the dugong, it's declined or extinct in at least a third of its global range, but it's very stable and in fact probably even increasing within the Australian part of its range. So globally we list the good dugong as being vulnerable because of partial reductions, but in Australia it's regarded as being least concern. So you've got this discrepancy between a national listing or regional listing and the global listing. But that's an artifact of the criteria, and it makes sense when you tease that information apart. It can also be the reverse. Sorry, I don't have an example from the region itself yet, but hopefully after the workshop we will have some. This is a South American mammal. So it's very widely distributed in South America, so it's least concerned globally. But in Venezuela, it's impacted by many different threats, and so it's listed as vulnerable within Venezuela. So two different scenarios there. Globally threatened, locally not threatened, globally not threatened, locally threatened. And we'll have several of those examples will come up through the workshop this week. Now those are the categories that we have at the global level, but to accommodate some of these situations at the regional level, we introduced two additional categories. One is called not applicable. So we may decide that some of the mammals that occur in the region, either it's just such a small part of their global range that's in the region, so we don't want to assess them. There's not much point in assessing them, so we treat them as not applicable. Or they may have been introduced into the region, and so we decide they're not applicable. Likewise, they may have gone extinct within the region. They still extant elsewhere, and so we would list them as regionally extinct. So classic case there would be lion, tiger, if we decided tiger occurred in the region, a few other species. We end up listing those as regionally extinct. So when we start doing the assessment process in the workshop, we need to identify which of these species are not applicable, and when David goes through the species list, that's one of the things we'll be deciding, is which ones we may decide, no, that we won't include that in the list for assessment. So we can remove some straight away early on in the process. We then do a preliminary assessment. So we just look at the species within the Arabian region, and we imagine that that species is endemic to the Arabian region. And so you apply the red list categories and criteria as though it was an endemic. So that's step 2. You then say, okay, does the species actually occur outside of the Arabian region? And if it does occur outside, does it impact on the populations within inside the region? Is there immigration, is there movement of individuals across the borders? And does it have a rescue effect? If it does, we then may want to adjust our initial assessment. So if we listed something as, say, endangered within the Arabian region, but it's in the northern parts and it's interacting with populations from Turkey or from further north, there may be a rescue effect, and so we may want to downlist. So we may have overestimated the extinction risk, so then we want to downlist it. So we move it from endangered down to vulnerable. If there's a massive rescue effect, we may even move it right down to near threatened. So that will be a discussion during the working groups as to, is there a rescue effect? How much do we downlist it? If we don't know, we follow the precautionary principle and say we'd rather keep it listed in the higher category as being endangered, just to be on the precautionary side, to make sure we don't underestimate the extinction risks. And then once we have the final assessment and we have the information about whether they're in protected areas or not, and we can start doing gap analyses and that kind of thing, then you get into the next phase where we start setting the conservation priorities for the region. Don't want to dwell too much on this. When you're deciding about which ones are not eligible for assessment, not applicable. So introduced taxa are example of that, where species have been moved by ship or whatever it is. There are a few species on Socotra, so Socotra forms part of the region. So there are various things that have gotten to Socotra by being brought by ship or other means, and so those are introduced taxa, and so we will decide, no, we're going to exclude them from the list, from the assessment process. We have to decide what those are. Vagrant taxa, things that are moving in and out just only there sporadically. Some of the cetaceans that David mentioned earlier, possibly some of the bats, other species. We have to decide whether we want to include vagrants in the process or not. That's entirely up to you. If you would rather, you think that some of these vagrants are important, that they may well establish breeding populations in time, then we can decide to assess them. That is entirely your decision. So that's where these regional guidelines can be flexible. So generally in this process we'll assess everything that is native to the Arabian region, particularly all the breeding ones. We have to decide about the non-breeding species, whether we include them or not. Species that have gone regionally extinct but are now recolonizing, either through reintroduction programs or other means. As I say, reintroduced taxa. What about species that are just on the edges of their range, so marginal taxa? Only have a very small portion of the global population within the Arabian region. Do we include those or not? And that's entirely up to everybody here, whether we do that or not. I know with the birds, David had said there was a big discussion about the birds, and generally they included most of the birds. The only ones that they excluded were things that had less than 0.1% were not from the region, of the global population not from the region. So it was a very, very tiny percentage. And then, of course, the non-breeding taxa, what do we do about those? Whether, do we include them or not? We can decide to introduce various filters about threshold percentages for these kinds of things, for the marginal species and for the non-breeding taxa, and we'll have a discussion around that when we come to the species list. And whatever we decide then gets put into the book, so it's very clear what thresholds we chose for including or excluding some of the species from the assessment process. So when we assess the species, we should use all the information we have obviously from within the region, but it's also important to also try and take into account information from outside the region. So what is happening further north and east of the Arabian region could have a big impact on the species within the region. If you've got species that are moving in and out, if there are major threats happening either to the north of the region or to the east, that rescue effect could diminish over time. And so that would affect the populations within your region. And so it's also important in the process to think about what may be happening outside. And we do have some of that information already from the global assessment. So we do have an advantage here that all mammals have been assessed globally, and we do have information about what's happening in other parts, in the neighboring areas to Arabia. And so we can use that to inform the assessment process within the region. So if you're losing all those on the outside, that would really have an impact on this area here, especially if there was movement coming in from the outside. If you lost those ones, you've got no rescue effect here, and so your species could then have a higher extinction risk as a result. So it may end up actually uplisting in some cases. For any of the endemics, obviously the regional assessment is the same as the global assessment, and as I say, we have about 15 or so species that are endemic to the region, and so those will be global assessments. In the regional guidelines booklet that you have, and there's also a separate handout for everybody, you'll have this flow chart, and these are the questions you have to walk through once you've done the initial assessment to decide whether you want to uplist or downlist the extinction risk outcome based on what's happening with your species and how it interacts with neighboring populations. So the top part is all about breeding populations. So you see you have a series of questions that you work through, but every case where you go, no, you don't know, or there's unknown, you keep your original assessment. But if there is interaction with populations outside of the region, you have to work your way through these questions and decide whether you want to downlist the category because you've overestimated the extinction risk, or you may want to uplist because you've underestimated the extinction risk. That tends to be a rare situation, but it does happen sometimes. And then possibly for the bats, and more importantly for the cetaceans, they'll be looking at this bottom part of the flow chart, looking at how visiting populations will affect the assessment within the region. And we won't go into any more details on those here now. We'll spend lots more time in the working groups looking at those flow charts so we get a better understanding of the questions and what they mean. Now, David mentioned about the information that we also capture in this process. So every species assessment will have a whole lot of supporting information, which is used to justify and come up with the actual red list assessment, to justify the category and criteria that you assign, but also allows all sorts of other analyses and use in conservation decision making. So this is the kinds of information that we generally collect at a global level, and we'll be doing much the same in the process here. So obviously we'll have information on taxonomy, common names, important that we know what the names of these species are, the category and the criteria, which countries within the region they occur in, and then really crucial, whereabouts in the region, the actual map, whereabouts in the region it is. There will be a short paragraph or two explaining how you decided your particular species was in whatever category and what criteria were used. And then we have information about the habitats and the ecology, what the threats are, conservation actions in place. Is it in a protected area? Is it not? Is it part of a breeding program, reintroduction program, that kind of information? And any references to back up that. And everybody that's involved in the assessment, you will all be assessors, your names are captured and formally documented. Your contribution is acknowledged and attributed to you throughout the whole process. It's really important that everybody that participates gets their names recorded and recognized for their contributions in the process. And that's it. So, any questions? I'm sure there are lots of questions. Mohammed.
First, for the global assessment, how many years normally is happening?
Say it again, sorry.
The global assessment, how many, how long?
Yes, I'm just trying to work out how to turn it on. These weren't invented when I was young. There's no obvious switch.
That's the bottom. At the very bottom.
I don't think it's working. I'm very technically gifted.
There we go, got one.
Thank you for the presentation. My question about the global assessment, how many years normally is happening? If it's a normal, what you also recommend for the regional assessment,
Okay.
for how long it will be applicable,
Okay.
because it's many times it is out of date. Some species is being changed in the list after a few years. So how do you think that it's because this is how to apply it in the future?
Yeah. Okay, so the question is how many times should we do reassessments of species? So for the global IUCN Red List, the recommendation is that every species should be looked at least once every 10 years. The reality is that because we rely on experts around the world to do this in their voluntary capacity, not every species gets looked at every 10 years. So after 10 years, they get marked as being in need of updating, just to show that they are now out of date and information may no longer be correct. Some taxonomic groups where there's lots of activity, particularly in the birds, all birds get reassessed completely every 4 years. So currently 10,300 birds. At the end of this year, they're probably going to be 11,000 plus birds. So the number of birds are increasing because of all the splitting. But all the birds will be reassessed again this year, and then again 4 years' time. But then even within the birds, all the critically endangered birds get looked at every single year. So there are 169 critically endangered birds. They get reassessed every single year to check that there's nothing bad happening, that they can pick it up very quickly and get conservation action happening. Some of the groups spend a lot of effort on the data deficient species, try and get those, gather much more information to get those out of the data deficient category into whatever the other categories that are relevant. So it depends very much on the taxonomic group that's been looked at. Some are looked at more frequently, others much longer. But for the region, I would say at least once every 10 years. It often takes a long time, especially when you come to rodents and bats. So you need long data sets, long-term data sets to pick up trends and to really cross the boundaries between red list categories. So 10 years is usually long enough time period to do that. So I would say at least every 10 years if you can. If you can do it sooner for the more threatened species, that's also very good to do that. Sorry, there's one here, then one at the back.
Okay, you mentioned suspected, and you emphasize that there is no need for like precise information when someone provide this information for the assessment. I attended an assessment 4 years ago here. Frankly, I would say I wasn't happy about the assessment.
Mm-hmm.
Because some of the people who provided information, it was more or less guessing. I think, I believe, maybe. And for us as scientists, I don't want to have, not accurate information. When they are talking about wolves, and they said, okay, they move in packs or individually, and then they asked about the packs, and they said, okay, maybe 7, and someone else said, no, maybe 3. And another one came up and he said, no, they move individually. All these will go into the IUCN website, and everyone is going to be reading this one. Our graduate students are going to read all this information, and it's just an opinion. I don't know about this guy, if he has been in the field, if he has observed, all these animals in the field to come up with this conclusion. And this is somehow, a scary thing for me.
Yeah.
So when you mention suspected, okay, I read the red flag. Is it true that this is the kind of information that you would accept to include it in the IUCN, global assessment? Partly from this part of the world where there is a big gap in here, and we try to fill this gap as much as we can. It's number one. Number two, good question. I have been in touch with the guys at the IUCN. I'm a mammalogist in Saudi Arabia, and I focus on bats. And I have seen the bats distribution map outdated. And we have a lot of species, and I would like to update the maps so we know that this species exists in Saudi Arabia and in this region. No one got back to me. So I said, okay,
Okay. Good. Two very good questions there. So the first one, with the red list process, we're dealing with people, and people have very different attitudes towards uncertainty. So if you look at this room here, there'll be a whole range of different attitudes. Some people will be very precautionary, so they really want, they'd rather call something more threatened than not threatened, just based on very, very minimal information. Others will be extremely evidentiary. You really want hard, fast scientific evidence before you list something as being threatened. And everybody will be on the spectrum between those two extremes. So with the red list assessment process, nobody's right or wrong. You have to try and take into account those extreme views. And so with the assessment, in the assessment process, you can record the minimum values, the maximum, and the idea is to try and work out what the best estimate is for each of the parameters. And then, because you've got the bounds of the uncertainty, that then gets factored into the assessment process. So you could end up with a listing saying it's this, but it could range from that to that. And it's really important to document that as part of the readiness process. And what often happens in these assessment workshops, you rush for time and that gets forgotten, and an individual can drive an assessment to a particular category and the other opinions get ignored. So it's really important to try and document that in the process.
I'm giving you the Arabian wolf as an example.
Yeah, yeah.
The marbles of that, maybe, a lot of people
Yeah.
don't know
Yeah.
that species. Miss out on
Yeah.
that species. But then if it's something else.
No, so it's important to document that range of information, range of opinion and uncertainty in the assessments, so it's very transparent. And how you came to that conclusion of whatever the category and criteria was needs to be well documented, well supported. And the recommendation from the IUCN side is that it should always be slightly more precautionary, on the precautionary side rather than evidentiary side. So that's the general recommendation on that. But it's important to document that. On your second question about how to get your information from the region fed back into the IUCN process. So you gave the example of the bats. The whole bat specialist group has been in a bit of disarray the last few years. It's only been recently reformed with a new chair, with regional co-chairs and regional focal points. They're only really getting going now. And so this is a key time for your information on bats to feed through into that process. And so as I said before, all the work from this workshop will feed into the global process, and we'll make sure that your information gets fed through to the right people in the bat specialist group.
Actually, you mentioned and talked about regional and local assessments, but I'm not sure whether you mentioned local or country-wise assessments or not. I absolutely agree that these local and regional are very important, but locally for the level of the country is not that much important. For example, here in the Emirates, unfortunately, we don't have any of our species listed in the global list according to IUCN categories. They created last year a big list here, but I believe most of them are not ecologically important or phylogenetically important. So we really need to create a regional database at the level of the whole Arabian Peninsula for all of our plants, and to define which really are regionally endangered and at the same time would be phylogenetically belonging to families or order, maybe with fewer species. So I believe those species we should
Very good comment, that. Thank you.
Can I just respond to that?
Yes, David.
Yeah.
Yes.
The whole purpose of the exercise now is to do the assessment for the Arabian region, for the Arabian Peninsula. So you'll have a regional list, and each species assessment will contain all the countries in which that species occurs. So you can immediately generate a national list of species that have been assessed at regional level, and you've already got them at global level, so you could then move on to doing a national level assessment if you thought it was useful. I mean, for some species, a wolf could walk from northern Iraq down to the south of Yemen if it wants to. There's no fences, there's nothing to stop it. So in some cases, a national assessment doesn't really add anything to the regional. Sometimes it will be very useful. So you have to just decide that for yourselves at that level. But what we're doing now is exactly what you said, is to produce a list of species, and you can then use that later to decide what you think is important or not. As Craig said, you've got the most threatened, and then you can refine that list by saying these are the ones that need most attention because. So I think that it's a very good point, but I think we're going to cover, I hope we're going to cover most of what you said during these 4 days. If we get partway through and we haven't, you can remind us and we'll be able to adjust.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Ihab. And actually, I have a recommendation here, and it's a very good opportunity having you here. And my recommendation is about the criteria themselves. I think the IUCN should start to review the criteria, because the application of the criteria on the global level is something different from the national level. And one of the clear example here is the area of influence as an example. So having disagreed with the dimension that you have applied on the global level, if you will start to apply it on the national level, it will not be applicable. So I think it's my recommendation to start reviewing the criteria, having it on the national level, regional level, and the global level.
So this issue has come up many times, that we should adjust the criteria and change the thresholds for the numerical values down to accommodate regional and country level assessments. There's absolutely no theoretical reason why we need to do that, and it's been debated endlessly. And if we did do that, how would we ever set the thresholds? Because if you're doing a red list for a tiny country, Bahrain, versus Iraq, two very different sized countries, where would you set the thresholds? It'd be impossible to decide what would make sense. And so it's best to stick to the global thresholds, and then you adjust them through this regional assessment process.
Thanks a lot, mate. That's great. There'll obviously be much more time during the meeting to go through to go into more detailed questions. I just want to make three very quick points before we break for tea and coffee. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, I didn't realise you had the microphone. Craig, you've got one other question.
It's just a little question, if you don't mind. Okay.
Sorry.
It's the term vagrant. As far as I know, it fits with birds. Now, how does it fit with mammals? And if yes, could you explain or give an example?
Yes, it does tend to get used very much with birds, but it would be relevant for cetaceans, where some of the whale or dolphin species may only just occur occasionally in the Arabian waters, so those may be vagrants. Some of the bat species, there may be bats that are flying up from Africa into the region, or from Eastern Asia into the region. So there's occasional visitors. That's the sort of other term you might use, occasional visitor rather than vagrant. So they're just one or two records every 10 years or so. Do you treat those as species that are in the region or not? And that's entirely up to you to decide. Some countries, some regions, if a species has been recorded there just once, no matter what the time period, they're treated as being part of the natural fauna of that region. And then they assess it. So that's entirely up to you to decide whether you...
For the vagrant, does it go back to its original place, or they could stay?
They could stay. Sometimes the vagrants come in, and eventually over time enough of them come in and they establish breeding populations within the country. Then of course they're no longer vagrants. Other times they come in, they're there for a year or two, and then they disappear. They've gone to another country, or they've gone back to where they came from. It varies from species to species. It's what may happen. With climate change, we know that lots of species are changing, their ranges are moving. And so as climate change starts to impact on the region, there may be other species that are coming into the area now because of the impacts of climate change. And we think they're vagrants now, but over time they may become regular visitors, and then...
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so just very quickly, if that looked a bit complicated, don't worry, because Craig's going to be leading one of the working groups, and he's the world's, he is the expert on this, and the other group is going to focus on small mammals, and Dr. Giovanni Amori is going from University of Rome, is going to be doing that one. He's there, and he's the Red List Authority Coordinator for the Small Mammal Specialist Group. So he's a small mammal specialist group, so shrews, hedgehogs, and all the rodents are going to be done in one block, and then the other mammals with Craig. So don't worry about that. Also, it usually we've found in the past with what we've done 600 assessments or more so far, 330 birds year before last, and 275 reptiles. That's just over 600 assessments. And we know from the experience that it always starts slowly as people just get used to the process, and then it speeds up. So if it's looking a bit slow this afternoon and you think, oh my goodness, we're never going to finish, we are. We've got plenty of time to do that, and we have ways of making this work. So that's good. A couple of tiny points that have arisen before. The words on the words used on the red list are sometimes misleading, and the lowest category of threat, least concern, just think of that as not least but lowest, because we are concerned about every species, and every time we've had a workshop somebody has said, why are we calling this species least concerned? Because we are concerned about it. So it's just the way that the words have been formulated that gives the wrong impression. So just think of that as lowest. And for data deficient, IUCN doesn't like to use data deficient unless you really know nothing. So it's sometimes very, very easy to say, oh, it's nearly coffee break, we don't know much, oh, data deficient, time for tea. A good rule of thumb for data deficient is, can it be anything from critically endangered to least concern? Do we know so little it could be anything from really common to really rare? And if the answer is yes, well, maybe data deficient applies. But if not, then really try and think hard about applying a category to it, because it's much more helpful. And on the point about the data quality, we can include in the text information such as, I think the example was whether wolves occur in 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s and 7s. We can easily include in the text of the assessment something like, various local reports from around the region suggest that wolves may move singly or in groups of 3 to 7. So we've got the fact that sometimes they're on their own, sometimes they're in groups of 3 or 7, and that this information is just local observations. And if it's published information, we'll actually cite the paper. So we'll say Arabian oryx have a gestation length of, and then there'll be a citation of somebody who's actually studied that and got that information. So I think that we can do that. And the final thing with it on the oryx is, this species has caused us a lot of problems on the red list because it's defining exactly which animals count as wild animals. Now in 2011, in 2008 actually, the species, was it 8? I think it's, I've forgotten, Andrew will probably correct me exactly, but about 2008, the numbers in the various reintroductions had reached the level which was too many for critically endangered or endangered, and it moved to vulnerable. There was a 5-year wait period, and then automatically in 2011 or 12, that started. And that's just because the thresholds are rigid. So it's really important in a few cases, and the oryx and some of the gazelles are those, as to which populations we actually include. So if the animal is receiving food and water every day, or it's just being occasionally given water if there's a condition of drought. So in Mahazat Aside, I think I'm correct in saying that water's provided in times of drought, but in Zamul here, Mayas, you can help me out, they're fed and watered every day. So there's two different situations for the oryx there, and a decision's got to be made as to where the line is. Do both of these count as fully managed and not for the red list, or is there a line between the two? So that's going to be a very interesting discussion in that group at the time, and that will be very useful actually for informing the red list generally, because this topic of reintroduction is cropping up more and more. I mean, there are scimitar-horned oryx and other species going to move back from EAD to Chad sometime in 2016. And there's lots and lots of examples in North Africa where we have the same situation. So, interesting debate on that. Right, I'm very sorry I've taken 5 minutes of the tea and coffee break. So, tea and coffee is outside. I'm not sure if Paul mentioned or not at the start, but there's just one little other housekeeping announcement, and that is, washrooms for the ladies are in the building, and washrooms for the gentlemen are in a new block just after the coffee thing, because we knew there were more people this year, so the facilities have been enlarged. So enjoy tea and coffee, and we'll see you back here at 11:30, please.
I figured out we've got 5 blocks, 5 possible sessions.
Yeah.
So what I can do is we can draw up a schedule, and put it up after the tea break, the first one today. So we announced it at that point. And